When I think of setting, I don't just think about like the location of where these things are set, but the purpose of the location as well.
Readers want to be experts in your world. People who read your book want to feel like they know what they're talking about.
And I could probably just
Hmm.
say the sky's blue, and everyone would be like, "Yeah, that sounds good to me." I think when you're doing the world building process, it's really easy to get caught up in.
Hi, I'm Max.
I'm Drew.
And I'm Leisha.
Plot hole.
Said I'd write one chapter, wrote none.
I'm sorry, you do what?
I changed the ending again.
Rewriters.
Countless blueprints.
Infinite stories. And now, into the story. I work a lot with what we already have in the modern world. I wanted to go ahead and spearhead this kind of interview style situation with the boys to ask some pointed questions about fantasy world building, but I'll also be kind of contributing my own kind of insights as I've been writing as well. So I kind of wanted to start off with our opening segment. Where in the world are we? So in each of your guys' current work in progress, talk a little bit about why the setting is important to the story and the characters.
So, when I initially started doing the world building process for the story that I'm writing, a big part of the magic system is that they can travel great distances pretty quickly, and so I wanted the world to be vast. I wanted the setting. I wanted each of the different settings to be unique, though, to be able to switch up, the places that my characters find themselves in, and to so when I started doing my world building process, I realized, I need some pretty fleshed out like cultures and architectural styles and things like that when I'm talking about the different parts of the world that they visit. And so that's been a pretty big part of the initial world building process is designing like terrain and that kind of stuff. Designing terrain and like ecosystems and climates has been really interesting, and it's been a lot of learning too. That's something that I don't feel like it's really talked about a lot with world building is the amount of research that you have to do on like what's it what are the weather people called meteorology. Thank you. uh
Meteor- Meteorographer is a really cool word, though.
yeah, my brain was like dying for a second, but
Meteorographer is like the study of the meteors themselves. That
gosh,
sounds cool.
that actually does sound cool though, huh? So that's something that I really had to focus on initially. I'm interested. I think Max's book has a much more interesting and unique setting, and I'm kind of interested to hear like his about his setting a little bit.
So I've talked a little bit about the setting over the course of our first couple episodes. And but like Drew, like my setting is intrinsically tied to the magic of the world. Um, I was I've had this like issue with my world building in the past where I try and make such a big world that I've zoomed out way too far, and my painting does not have any details. It's abstract paint. It's a lot of big blobs, not a lot of substance. So I'm trying to zoom in on like a specific, like smaller setting this time around. And so I've got my story is set in um of a industrial city that's spilling over the side of a crater. Um and this crater has kind of this radiation magic coming from it, and the fallout of this radiation magic has given people power. Um, so that's kind of like where I'm starting off from. Um, it's definitely key to the story because of it's like the setting is where the magic is. It's where the characters like are, and I'm not really leaving it. I actually have to say I'm taking a little bit of inspiration from Cyberpunk. Or is that the name of
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
game? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Have you ever? I don't think you've watched the Cyberpunk Edge Runners, Drew. I think we talked about this.
Yeah, I haven't
But
seen it,
it's
but
the Netflix show. I have not played the game. I have watched the show. And it's a really cool because it's like they really flesh out the setting of that city and only that city. Like you don't really learn about the rest of the world, what's going on. So you kind of get to focus in on that. And that's what's been really nice about that is like focusing in on the one setting so that I can focus on the one story with the characters.
You guys have set this up so beautifully for me.
Okay.
Well, so I kind of want to dig into this a little bit further. So I guess I need to talk about my own setting.
Yeah, where in the world is your book set? Because we actually know this one.
Yeah. So there's actually a couple of things when it comes to setting, because when I think of setting, I don't just think about like the location of where these things are set, but the purpose of the location as well. The first book in the series that I've been writing is a contemporary romance, but it's also kind of a Regency romance. A good chunk of this book actually takes place at a retreat that is meant to cater to like people getting to live in like a Regency setting. So they dress like people from the Regency era, they eat things from that era, they, participate in activities that, people during that time were participating in. And so it's entrenched in kind of like this like escape from reality. So I do get like a component of fantasy within it. So I'm excited to kind of be able to talk a little bit more about that and kind of its purpose throughout the book. But actually, physically, where these characters are actually placed is across the world from each other. She's from California, he's from Massachusetts, which is very similar to myself and Max growing up. So it's also going to include the vast differences between the two, where you have somewhere like Massachusetts that's deeply entrenched in history, academia, and just kind of like having walked through Boston, it was unlike anything that I had ever seen living on the West Coast. And whereas like the West Coast is definitely always up and running, always, on to the next thing, what's trending now, that kind of thing. So I'm hoping to kind of be able to elaborate a little bit more on those kind of differences between the two. So I kind of wanted to talk a little bit with you guys about the world building layers, because I feel like there's a ton of layers, and obviously like you guys talked a little bit about what's on the macro level and then what's on the micro level. So stuff on the macro level would be stuff like, what's the religion? What's the magic system? What's technology look like? What's the history of the world? Whereas micro level, you're looking more at stuff like, what does this person eat for breakfast? How do people talk to each other? What is considered taboo in society? So kind of more so along those things. So I kind of wanted to open that up to you guys. What has building the macro and micro levels looked like? And have you guys run into any snags?
Okay. Can I take this first, Max? I have a really specific example that I want to use from my world.
Go for it.
Okay. So in my world that I built, there is a large continent that the majority of the people live on, and I made it so that way the moon orbits really slowly around the planet. Like once a year, the moon completes its orbit. So that affects the tides a lot. And when that happens, the rivers that cross this continent actually reverse course and flow the other way across the continent, because the tides are so high on one side of the world for so long. And I made it so
That's
that
really
way,
cool.
Going like niching down a little bit into like food, there is a delicacy from a specific region where these fish, this is getting crazy, but these fish lay eggs on these like dry stalks of grass that are covered in the water, covered with the water. And then as the season changes, the water goes down, and the eggs that are laid on the sticks are protected from predators. But the eggs on the sticks are actually a delicacy in certain regions, and people will go and just harvest these stalks of plant, and you can just slurp the eggs right off of the stick. And so I went
Egg on a Stick sounds like a wild startup company, by the way.
but like it's what's fish eggs called? Calamari or what? No,
No, calamari is caviar.
Caviar. Thank you. I was close, kind of.
Calamari is a squid.
I had water in there, but anyways,
you were. That's like Pokemon logic there.
Okay.
I was in the same area,
same
in the
type.
world, maybe.
But anyways, because I recently, what inspired this was I recently had to drive a friend. His car broke, had a flat tire, didn't break down. His car had a flat tire, and he was like, "Dude, I have to go do this video shoot for this company. Can you please take me?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure, man." So him and we went on this little trip to a city that's like, I don't know, an hour away or so. And the event for this company was oh my gosh, it was a type of alcohol. I can't remember. But it was like an alcohol tasting event. And I'm sitting there watching this, and he's explaining, like, the guy who's hosting the event, he's explaining like where the alcohol comes from, how it's made, um, what flavors you should expect in the different ways that you can try it. Like, he's talking about, like, just take a sip, and then there's take a sip and like and like let it sit in your mouth for a second, and then there's take a sip and like chew the liquid, and chewing the liquid actually brings out different flavors and stuff. And I know that this is real because I'm watching the people around the table react differently to the same drink. I don't drink alcohol, if that's not obvious, but I'm I am watching people react differently to the same drink by consuming it in a different way each time. And I was like, man. So I brought my little notepad with me, so I pulled out my notepad and I started writing down regional, like, alcohols that would exist in my world, and how they would be brewed, and what plants were used, and what the fermentation process was used in order to, like, develop these and stuff. And so I created this specific alcohol that is, like, sweet when you first drink it, but then when you swallow it, it actually turns spicy in your mouth. And I wrote that down, and so, like, that's something that I developed. I don't know. I really enjoy world building for food, if you can tell. And but, like, doing that and getting down into, like, that kind of stuff is, like, so much fun because you can write that into a scene, like, where your character goes to a part of the world where all the people are, like, slurping fish eggs off of sticks, and he's like, or your character's like, what in the world is going on here? But then they get to learn they get to learn something about the culture there, and that teaches them, potentially, they get to have a sit down conversation and learn and progress the plot that way. That's just, sorry. I've had so much fun world building with, like, that little stuff. It's been a blast.
Good. I'm glad that has been, like, something you've been able to dig into. And so I'm going to put a pin in that because there's also another thing, like, when it comes to research, that I want to ask you guys. But Max, what has been your experience?
So I have not yet created a menu for my characters, but I started realizing, like, pretty early on, like, how do animals work in my world too? Because I mean, these people are living in a crater, it's basically like, as, like, the sky is always, like, kind of this auburn color because it's just, like, sun shining through the clouds. And I was like, I don't even know what, like, animals are we living here. If they are, they're probably, like, kind of mutated from what we would see, while the people aren't mutated, like, in any way. They've kind of gained power from this. Like, what do the animals look like? Early on, I have a character who's in a horse-drawn carriage, and my main character is, like, surprised to see a horse. He's heard about them, but he's never seen one in person. Whereas, like, in our world, like, a horse is a horse. I mean, that's how everyone was transported back in the day. And then, so yeah, it's interesting to see, like, how do my characters react to certain things in the world too. And then, like, I guess the macro side of things, I have thought a little bit about religion. I'm not quite sure what that's going to look like yet. I've been liking, discovering things as I'm writing. Like, oh, actually, I can give this example. I just written a scene where the main character is sharing a drink with somebody, and it's kind of, like I said, it was a little bit of an industrial city, but, like, it's got this fantasy setting, so they're not quite, like, it's kind of Industrial Revolution-esque. And I was thinking, how do they, cool their beers in a probably pretty warm setting. And so I kind of came up with, like, a way that the magic system works, where they've put it into, like, so they've chilled something using their magic and put it alongside the beers. And so, like, this guy is going to this tavern who's, like, known for his cold beers, because that's just, like, it's a rare delicacy. Everyone else used to drink kind of, like, lukewarm drinks, and he's got these cold drinks that he's invested time and effort and magic into making happen. So the macro and micro are pretty fun to kind of explore. And I've been having a good time, like, just letting that flow in that scene as it's happening. Like, what does this look like? And maybe stepping aside to write down a note or two, or just coming up with it on the spot. It's been really, really fun.
I think my experience with setting thus far from a macro micro level is obviously a lot of my macro is there. Like I can rely on, things that have happened in our history or, kind of the technology of the modern age. So like those are things on the macro level that are really taken care of. But I think on a micro level, especially when I'm utilizing something like a retreat that's Regency themed, I can kind of play a little bit more with the micro level where you're now having to watch people interact with each other in a way that's completely foreign to us in the modern day. Like this isn't how they typically communicate. We're living literally in Pride and Prejudice, which I'm sure that just like me, there's at least four other women that also want to experience this. So I think that that's been a really cool thing to kind of get an idea of. And I kind of want to shift into this next point that I wanted to make in talking a little bit more about research. Because I feel like for me that I've gone down a ton of research rabbit holes when it comes to like understanding specifically Regency themed things, as well as like the geographical location in which I'm trying to write about. I'm going to keep the geographical location a secret still. You guys get the state, but not where. Yeah. So one of the things that has been really tough for me is like really trying to research what things kind of look like. My male main character is an English professor, and he is supposed to be teaching this class about a book. So I actually read the book. I did a ton of research on the book, and I went down a complete rabbit hole because I'm sitting here like, what in the world is going on? Because the book that he's reading is Mansfield Park, which is a Jane Austen book. I don't know if anyone's ever read that book, but when you compare Mansfield Park to literally any other of Jane Austen's works, whether it's Emma, Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, whatever, it is so unbelievably dry in comparison when you look at like the heroine of that book versus everything else. Like Jane Austen is really good at writing dynamic heroines. Like, you look at Elizabeth Bennet, Emma, and you just, think about how like they're wonderful like characters that, embody so many things that I think a lot of us struggle with, which is like sometimes they're naive, sometimes they're, outspoken, sometimes they're like untraditional. Whereas you look at, the heroine of Mansfield Park, Fanny Price, she is such a far cry from these like incredible heroines. She's very meek. And so as like I'm trying to create this situation where he's really struggling with trying to figure out how do I teach a bunch of 20-year-olds about a character like that they, can't relate to it and have them focus on that solely for 4 months, So he's like really trying to dig into it. And so I was also going through that of like, how in the world do I even make, like, how do I make this a focal point when this is something that I myself am not understanding? But as I like continue to do research, I've actually realized that I can really use it in my favor. And so I'm very excited to continue to allow that to unravel. So that's just an example of a research rabbit hole that I've gone down. So for you guys, like when does research help versus when does it become like, when does it paralyze you as a writer?
So I think I could speak to this. Like I said, my magic system is kind of radiation based. So I started doing a little bit of research, just some like surface level research about like different kinds of energies, kinetic energy. Where does radiation come from? What is that? What does it even mean? And it led me down some rabbit holes where I was like, I could make this like super realistic, but then I risk either delving into like a science fiction aspect or worse, committing the terrible fallacy of pretending I know what I'm talking about. When I am not a degree holding scientist of any kind. So I've done a little bit of research, enough to kind of give myself the bones of what I want to do. But then the rabbit holes kind of did disperse from there a little bit. Like I was talking about earlier, like what is the temperature like in this? Because the crater always hot, but actually, like I started learning a little bit more about like, oh shoot, what's it called? It's called nuclear winter. So I started doing a little bit of research into that, like what does nuclear winter look like, and like it's actually really cold and everything. And we even have examples in some like science fiction stories about nuclear winter. So it's kind of cool to like start looking into that world a little bit and see how does it play into mine. Um, but I think to answer your question about balancing like reasonable um, elements of research with the fiction aspect, I think it just has to be inspired by. It doesn't have to make perfect sense, and can be used a little bit in the fiction sense of, especially in the fantasy sense of, there is magic involved. As long as I think a lot of people just want it to kind of make sense to them. It doesn't necessarily have to be plausible. Does that make sense? Am I
Yeah,
making that up?
I definitely feel like there are certain elements that it's kind of okay to just play with it and see what happens. And if it, if it works out, if it makes sense, if it feels like it makes sense, good for you. There are a couple of interviews that I've listened to recently about research where if you have someone who is an expert on the topic reading your book, that aspect of the book for them is going to like totally pull them out of the world. But I think research is hard because there's you want to know what you're talking about, especially if you're writing a book that exists in on Earth, or in some context.
Sure.
That and there's so okay, I'll give you an example. I for whatever reason I thought this would be cool. I'll probably end up having to change this, but the solar system that like the planet that my characters exist in has two suns, and for whatever reason I fell down a what color would the sky be rabbit hole on my world. And I eventually kind of just realized this does not matter at all. The answer is green, by the way, but the I was just like the after I think I spent probably an hour reading like all of these like scientific journals about what color the sky would be depending on what kind of sun your planet rotates around. And then if there's two different suns and they happen to be two different kinds of suns, then it would actually change the color of the sky in this way. And it would look like, and it would be this color during the sunset, and it would be this color during the sunrise. And it just be doing research is definitely a necessary part of writing, but I would say do enough to get your answer and then move on, because I totally spent a completely unnecessary amount of time trying to figure out what color the sky would be when I'm going to reference what color the sky is probably twice in my whole book. And I could probably just say the sky's blue, and everyone would be like, "Yeah, that sounds good to me." Even an an astronomer would be like, "Yeah, that's fine." you know.
I think the best bet is like Brandon Sanderson talks about in one of his lectures about how your readers want to be experts in your world. People who read your book want to know, like, be an expert and like feel like they know what they're talking about. And I think giving when you get too nitty gritty with the details of it all, you run the risk of getting so complicated that your audience is gonna either forget details or know such hyper specific details that even you don't know the answer to. If someone asks you
Yeah.
what color is the sky in your book, does that matter at all? Probably not.
Yeah.
So I think eliminating those, I think that's also like a tough thing with world building and setting as well, is just finding the details that matter. um like I think a important part of my story right now is my plot revolves a lot around political intrigue and economic disparity between like some classes and such too, and there's a distinct like the city, because it starts off at the top of the crater and kind of spills down. Like I have a distinct like, this is where the slums are, this is where like the main city is, the rich people are on the top of the hill. Like it's very distinctive in terms of that. Does that make perfect sense for like, but I'm not a city planner, so I'm gonna say no. But it helps illustrate something in my story, and I think that's where like some of the purpose of place is as well, is the setting can tell part of your story for you. I don't have to say, oh, the people in the slums are poorer than the people in the rich in the glittering city, the glittering part of the city, the district of I always forget the name of my own city. I swap between Glintcrest and Guildcrest all the time. I don't.
Guildcrest.
I think Guildcrest. I think Guild.
say.
Yes. Anyway, that was live, by the way, folks. You will you now know. Name of the cities, or the rich district, is Guildcrest. Anyway, people are from there. Like, if I gave you just the names Guildcrest and the Sink, what would you say would be the district where the poor people live?
The Sink, for sure.
Probably the Sink. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's where I think setting can play a role, and world building can play a role. I don't have to necessarily describe it as much. I still want to describe it, obviously. I think descriptions are really fun, kind of like paint the world. But, your research and the way you choose things, the choices you do make, help to tell part of your story for you. Drew, if you kept your green sky, I'm sure that science nerds across the world will be very excited about that. But at the end of the day, like, does that help progress your fantasy story? I guess that's the questions that we have to ask ourselves.
There's a big difference between relevant details and not relevant details. And I think when you're doing the world building process, it's really easy to get caught up in trying to answer every question when you need to only answer the relevant ones.
I will say, I am writing somewhat of a mystery too. I'm excited to include irrelevant details that no one will know if they're relevant or not. Because, like,
that's what you have to do as a detective.
You have to do that. And then also, people who are fans of like TV shows or book series and stuff, like, they get hyper specific when they're like big fans of them. Like, fan bases are crazy when it comes to details, and so they like to like spin all these fan theories. And I'm sure most of the authors of these like works probably don't even realize that they're like, oh yeah, that totally connects, huh? That's cool. And so that's what I'm excited to do too, is include details that may or may not be relevant, but maybe someone finds relevance in it.
Yeah, I'm definitely really excited if we ever get published to do like a panel where somebody asks me a question that I don't know the answer to, and I can just be like, yeah, that's totally a thing.
Oh yeah. Yeah, making something up on the fly.
Yeah, just be like, that's canon now.
Yeah, our DM, shout out to Johnny again.
We'll have him on sometime.
he would actually do that quite frequently, and at the end of any of our campaigns, he's always done a DM tells all, where we can ask him any questions regarding the campaign, and he'll tell us like, what it meant or what was the thought process behind that or whatever. There were definitely points where we would straight up ask him a question. He'd go, I don't know, man. I just made it up. I just made it up on the spot.
I mean, that's what writing is, yeah.
Oh my gosh. It's so funny, because the thing about like in a collaborative storytelling setting is there's one person who has control over the narrative. It's weird being the character that has to be like, that's being put through it. As an author, we're the all-knowing, omniscient presence in the world, right? But like when you are in a situation where you have to behave as a character, it can be really bizarre, kind of like knowing that your fate is in the hands of someone that controls everything. But I wanted to point out one thing that you had mentioned, because I feel like, there's a lot to storytelling, especially when it comes to setting. And so one of the things I also wanted to bring up is that I think, especially from a contemporary standpoint, community is also a part of the setting. Mm-hmm. So like my side characters are really important to the characters and help kind of convey like emotions, which I think can also convey setting as well. I also think that like the power of the familiar is important to take note of as well. Like there are just spaces that we are familiar with, regardless of like where they are. I'm trying to think of like a specific example. Like if someone has like a broken down playground in their backyard and you can like imagine the sound of like a creaky swing, or a diner where like like the server knows their regulars. Like these are all things that we can conjure up in our minds that are not hard to think of. And so I have relied on that a lot also in the sense of when someone walks into their home, it's like somewhere that they're comfortable. So when something happens to their home, you feel devastated because you can only imagine what that would feel like for yourself. So I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about that. Are there like elements of the familiar, elements of like realism that like really help convey the setting, and where your stories kind of take place, even if it's just from like an emotional standpoint?
Yeah, I think there's definitely I've trying to draw into aesthetic tropes of things like steampunk or Art Deco, um, kind of tropes of like that Victorian era with Industrial Revolution aspects. I want that to be kind of the setting, and I think that's where a lot of my familiarity is going to come from. I a big part of my story is going to be like information too, so it's going to have things like newspapers and things. I'm not going to talk about like where the paper came from. Like everyone knows where paper comes from, like it's trees. Are there trees in the crater? Probably not, but or maybe there are. I don't know yet. We'll see. So it's like that's what's kind of fun about it though, is that like that familiarity, I don't have to explain every little detail. A lot of people know what newspapers are. They know what a police department does. They know what a judge does. They know, oh, there's factories down by the crater. Cool. Like that. I don't have to like delve into hyper detail for people to be familiar with certain things.
You don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's kind of my point, I guess.
Moments of familiarity. Do you mean like stuff that, yes, we're in a fantasy world, but this feels like familiar to readers or to me, or
Correct.
okay.
Correct.
Well, so I grew up in a desert, and I lived most of my life in a desert. In fact, I currently still live in a desert. And my main character,
I love the desert.
my main character is from a a part of the world that's a desert. And so I think when it comes to familiarity, I am trying to achieve that in like small day-to-day interactions. Like for example, my book opens up with my main character's mom making some bread. And she's just like, yeah, I'm just like making this bread for some family that like just moved into the neighborhood. We're gonna give them like a housewarming gift. I think I try to find that familiarity in my interactions with people, especially in my interactions of like kindness or support for others, just so that way people can be like, okay, people in this world are like they're normal people, right? Who are being affected by things beyond their control, which is something that we're all experiencing, especially right now with like economy and world events and things like that. We're all like normal people just trying to get by, but are being affected by events and things that are outside of our control, and we're just doing our best. And I think that's one of the main reasons that I really enjoy the fiction and fantasy genre, is you can kind of dial those events that are affecting everybody's lives to 11, but still like have people just be people and do their best to overcome trials in those circumstances. And that's, I don't know, that's kind of what I'm trying to shoot for when it comes to like familiarity and making it feel like it's a universe that they could see themselves in as a reader.
Absolutely. And I think something to also kind of glean from that too is that sometimes like when we're able to kind of superimpose like those challenges in just regular everyday life in a story and then watch the character overcome it, it helps, bring a little bit of comfort to us who may be going through very similar things. Or I think it helps kind of bring a level of comfort where when we see our heroes, our characters overcome something that deeply relates to something that we may be going through, especially when it comes to world events, the kind of powerlessness in certain, aspects, things that just fall outside of our realm of control. I think watching characters overcome it helps give us a little bit of hope. Sometimes it emboldens us to be able to overcome certain challenges. And so I think that's a really important aspect of setting and just fiction in general that helps make it not even just escapism, but something that, can really help heal. I'll never forget. I want to say that I've already talked about this or touched on this in a different episode, but a couple of years ago, Max and I went to a horror writing conference where they had a author, come and talk a little bit about writing the genre of horror and like why why do people write horror? Because like I am one of those people that likes to be scared. Like I grew up watching horror movies. It's always a bonding thing with my family. My best friend and I, we grew up watching them together, and anytime we're together, we try to, see if there's another one that we like. One of the things that stuck with me from this conference was he said that horror allows us to experience trauma in a safe way. Obviously, a lot of the time when we do experience trauma, it is completely out of our control. Even if we make decisions that ultimately get us into the wrong place at the wrong time, it's still ultimately something that transpires and is tragic. Whereas when we're reading or watching the horror genre, we are experiencing something that's like just past the realm of real. Like that's just outside of like, the bounds of what could possibly happen. Like I'm not going to be I'm, worried about getting into a car accident more than I'm worried about, being killed in my sleep by Freddy Krueger, So like there's like a level of I think inherent weird comfort, even though it's macabre at best, that kind of comes from those things. So that's the other thing that kind of came to mind when it comes to like the importance of those settings. Sometimes it just helps you process things.
I do want to circle back to one last point as we wrap up here. Leisha, you touched on community earlier about how that's kind of part of our setting, and I was thinking about that as we've been talking, and we talked about like how certain people are our world, our family members, maybe our children, our. I want to world builds like for that as well, like those communities that our characters are part of. Like my main character, I picture him a little bit like a loner, but but being a loner doesn't make sense for his character as I'm like already introducing friends of his and already introducing people that are gonna be interacting with him, and I'm excited to have that because I think everyone, whether or not they have people around that do care for them, everyone wants that, and I think that's something of familiarity, something of setting that people want to read about is those side characters, those people that we really care about on the sidelines that are either cheering on the main character or putting roadblocks in their path. We really love those characters. At least I do. I love most of my favorite characters of stories is rarely the main character. I don't know. Do you guys have any more thoughts about community in world building?
To touch on that a little bit more, I think characters are ultimately shaped by their environment, and obviously setting is a really key component of the environment, but I think it's important to also acknowledge that we're built by the people around us. And so I love being able to use like side characters. Fortunately, my male main character in the first book has siblings, which will also be in future books as well. And getting to see their dynamic and the ways, in which their parents have raised them, like their interests, what they do professionally as adults. Like all those things are going to really factor into who they are as you learn about them and read about them in a way that like I could not build, from them just spending, all of their time in one place. Like I love that because of the people that they know, it creates kind of this dynamic setting, without them having to even move from one spot.
I really like what Max said about liking his side character or liking side characters more than main characters sometimes. Bro, by the way, rip the chapter 1 POV character. I still miss that guy. from your
I
book.
knew you were gonna bring that up.
He's gonna bring it up every time.
Dude,
I
that
don't even
guy,
know-
gosh, that flipping ripped my heart out. I was like, dude,
He wasn't even the POV character for the full chapter. It was like the first couple paragraphs.
dude, still though. Oh my, that poor guy. I don't know. I feel like he was
Yeah,
framed. He
like-
definitely wasn't even in jail for doing what they said he did. That's my headcanon.
No, that was kind of the point. Yeah, it was. But there you go. That's actually a good example of like the setting. Like, I'm starting to set up this idea that like they're not like what they should be, and as we're going through the city more, it's gonna become more and more apparent of how people's ethics are and everything. So anyway, but thank you for mourning the loss of a character who was there for like 250 words.
Bro, mark my words, he's gonna be one of the most famous characters from your book. I promise.
He will maybe.
The people are gonna demand a standalone novel from his POV.
It's just a prequel about the old man for like half of chapter 1.
I'm telling you, we're gonna need it. But I've been wanting to ask this question the entire time to Leisha specifically because you're not doing a lot of world building in terms of like creating something. In the type of writing that you do, it already exists. How do you go about like finding the line that is okay to like cross and like kind of make some stuff up about the era or the time or the area that the people are in? What do you think is okay in terms of when you're writing historical fiction or fiction that exists in our world?
Yeah, actually, this is a great question because this is actually something they've been battling recently. So obviously, as I mentioned, male main character, English professor. He lives in Massachusetts. Okay, which Ivy League school does he teach at? I don't think I want him to be teaching at Ivy League school. I don't know if I want him to be teaching at a real life school that exists in Massachusetts. So sometimes I run into these situations where I'm never quite sure what's okay to use from the real world and what isn't, just in case, someone starts to hunt me down and say, hey, you can't do that. So sometimes that's tough. Like I mentioned last time that I read hockey romances, and a lot of the time they actually don't specify that they're with the NHL. They utilize like some other acronym to stay away from, getting sued by the NHL for using their name. So sometimes I run into situations like that. So sometimes that can be difficult. That's a very like literal, real situation that I find myself running into.
I just have to butt in because I love it in stories when they come up with like, or like TV shows when they come up with like companies that are like adjacent from what our companies. So like, if it's like Facebook, it's like instead of face, or it's my face instead of MySpace, or
or like when in iCarly, where instead of having
I was
Apple
literally
products,
about to
Pear
say
product.
They use the pear code. Yeah.
Yeah.
Back in like the old Disney days, they used Amex for everything.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So, so sometimes I run into situations like that. It is kind of a line that you have to toe just because you don't want to step on the toes of anyone else. So I think that that's something that I am still kind of trying to grapple with and see what I want to do. But I think like ultimately, as long as my characters are the focus, I have a lot more creative liberty with like what really exists, what's actually true, what's accurate, those kinds of things. Because the last thing I'm ever going to say is that I'm an expert on any of the things that I'm writing about, the hope is that the experiences that I'm writing about are things that I understand and empathetic or sympathetic to. So I think that I rely more on that than like the contingencies of the setting in my storytelling. But the hope is that I can convey it like well enough that, any pitfalls that I might run into aren't going to be detrimental to like the purpose or the intended impact I'm hoping to have on an audience.
Are there any tools that you guys use that you think help with world building or like making your setting better? And I'll start with an example. Like Max introduced me to Incarnate, which is just a map making tool.
Oh yes,
dude, that one rocks. I love it so much. Are there any other tools that you guys use to like help with that?
Yeah, It's actually funny you brought this up. I have a friend who messaged me recently who said he started listening to the podcast, and he said that he's writing a story. Shout out to Mitch. We'll have him on at some time.
Mitch.
Let's go. And he mentioned that he's been using Hero Forge to kind of create the look for his characters. Hero Forge is like a online like tool that you can use to make miniatures for like D&D or for like other kind of miniature style campaigns, that kind of thing, tabletop games. And he sent me like 8 pictures of just all of his characters and like dynamic poses and like this is what I want them to look like. And I totally remember doing that for like my D&D characters back to, and I was like, man, I should start doing that to really flesh out what my characters look like. So Hero Forge, that's another great, I think, tool for building like what characters will look like. And yeah, that and Incarnate are my 2 go-tos right now.
Not sponsors, by the way.
Hey, yo, but listen, we'll take them.
Yo, not yet.
Not yet, yeah.
So I don't use any like specific tools per se. Like, I'm not a big into apps per se, other than ChatGPT to help me kind of like research and flesh out some concepts and ideas for things. One or 2 things that I use a lot when it comes to like really trying to just like kind of piece things together are creating mood boards. So I love making a Pinterest board. So sometimes like I'll compile like different pieces of inspiration. That way I can kind of look through it and be able to understand a little bit more about like what I'm wanting to convey. I also create playlists. So I have a playlist for each of the books that I've been planning, and I've been fleshing them out with different things. And so I talked about this, I think, in episode 1.
Yeah, I think that's
but
right.
The songs that I utilize in these are also sometimes historically accurate in comparison to like different situations within the book. It's been really nice to be able to utilize some of those things to kind of just be able to, I don't know, use it as a tool to kind of build upon my world.
Puts you in the mood to like write that style of setting too.
I'm creating a setting for setting.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we want to head into our weekly word count segment?
Yeah. I think we'll definitely come back to setting at some point in world building, but because there's so much to talk about with it.
Yeah,
but,
seriously.
Let's move on to our weekly word count.
Hey, word builders. This week was completely insane for all 3 of us. Max and Leisha were moving. I had a flooded basement. So the word count for this week is I was at 0, Max was at 0, and Leisha was at 376. This next week, though, we're going to get right back into it and keep building our stories, and we hope that you do too. And we'll see you guys in the next episode.